Has a policy designed to empower home ownership inadvertently exacerbated the UK's housing crisis? This question lies at the heart of our exploration today. The housing affordability crisis in Britain has reached unprecedented levels, with average home prices soaring to 8 times that of annual incomes. This has had acute implications for the working class, as housing costs have become increasingly prohibitive, forcing many to rely on private rentals. The consequences of this crisis include rising homelessness, the segregation of communities based on socio-economic lines, and a growing divide between property owners and those who cannot afford to enter the housing market. To better understand the roots of this crisis, it is crucial to examine the historical context and political decisions that have shaped the housing landscape in Britain. In the aftermath of World War II, Britain faced a severe housing shortage, with 500,000 homes destroyed and many more in dire condition. Recognizing the urgency of the situation, Clement Attlee's Labour government embarked on an ambitious programme of public home building. The goal was to provide equal access to affordable homes that met the needs of working people. The Town and Country Planning Act of 1947 nationalised the right to develop land, allowing local authorities to regulate new property development. This approach aimed to ensure that land was used for the benefit of the community rather than for speculative purposes. The Labour Party's radical agenda of public home building and land regulation alarmed the Conservative Party, which saw it as a threat to individual property rights. In the 1950s, Conservative politician Anthony Eden popularised the concept of a property-owning democracy as a counter to Labour's socialist advances. Eden's vision, rooted in the belief that expanding the number of property owners would neutralise the appeal of socialism, gained traction within the Conservative Party. In 1951, the Conservative Party came to power with a promise to build 300,000 houses per year. Housing Minister Harold Macmillan, despite initially championing the role of the private sector, soon realised that public home building was necessary to meet this ambitious target. Simultaneously, the Conservative Party introduced policies to encourage home ownership, such as making cheap mortgages more readily available and easing restrictions on private home construction. These measures kick-started a dramatic rise in home ownership that would continue for decades. Some Conservatives began advocating for public housing tenants to own their homes during the 1970s. Although Macmillan himself was initially sceptical, restrictions preventing the sale of public housing were gradually removed under subsequent Conservative-led governments. The breakthrough came with Margaret Thatcher, who saw the right to buy as a means of transforming Britain into a property-owning democracy. The Housing Act of 1980 introduced the right to buy, granting public housing tenants the legal right to purchase their homes at a discount of up to 50%. This move was seen as a way to empower individuals and promote social mobility. Thatcher's housing revolution was not limited to right to buy. Her government also pursued financial deregulation, which profoundly impacted the housing market. The removal of lending restrictions and the incentivization of commercial banks to engage in mortgage lending transformed the role of banks in the economy, leading to a flood of credit into the housing market. This in turn fueled a house price boom and incentivized households to take on larger mortgage loans. Thatcher's policies, including the right to buy and financial deregulation, not only reshaped the housing market, but also had a huge influence on the ideological outlook of the working class. These policies eroded socialist sentiment by giving more people direct access to private property and unearned wealth. Home ownership became the primary source of wealth for the majority of households, further entrenching the appeal of a financialized housing market. The housing crisis in Britain is not a natural or inevitable phenomenon, but the result of carefully planned political projects spanning several decades. Policies such as the right to buy and financial deregulation have exacerbated inequality and social divisions. The working class, who historically benefited from social housing, have switched allegiance after buying their council homes. Their children and grandchildren may never be housed by the local authority because those who purchased via the right to buy have effectively pulled the ladder up behind them. The right to buy had an immediate and acute impact on the housing landscape in Britain. It led to the privatization of valuable homes once owned by the state. More than 2 million publicly owned properties were transferred into private hands between 1980 and 1995, drastically reducing public housing stock. The increase in privately owned rental properties has driven up rents, making housing unaffordable for many low-income individuals and families. This has resulted in a heavy reliance on housing benefits to cover the cost of rent, with approximately 40% of the budget now going to private landlords. The right to buy has inadvertently contributed to the skyrocketing housing benefit bill and perpetuated the cycle of poverty for those in need of affordable housing. As council tenants exercised their right to buy, the number of available affordable homes decreased significantly. Most of those homes have not been replaced. Consequently, the number of social housing units available has fallen due to inadequate public sector funding. The right to buy not only forced local authorities to sell their properties to existing tenants at a heavily discounted price, but the government also banned councils from using the money from the sale of housing stock to build new housing. Half the proceeds of the sales were paid to the local authorities, but they were restricted to spending the money to reduce their debt until it was cleared, rather than being able to spend it on building more homes. This depletion of social housing stock has contributed to the current housing crisis in the UK, with a severe shortage of affordable homes for those in need. The policy also concentrated the poorest and most disadvantaged households in public housing, while wealthier tenants were better positioned to take advantage of the right to buy. The quality of public housing suffered, and taxpayers ultimately bore the costs of the policy through subsidies and increased spending on housing benefits. There were alternatives to the right to buy, such as the cash incentive scheme, which was introduced in the 1970s as a precursor to the right to buy. Through the cash incentive scheme, council tenants were given a grant to buy a home in the private sector, thus releasing a home for people on the waiting list. This helped tenants who were just short of the money they needed to buy a home to become homeowners. The size of the grant was dependent on the number of bedrooms in the property to be released. So, a tenant living in a 3 or 4 bedroom property would receive a bigger grant than someone giving up a 1 bedroom property. Tenants giving up a house would receive an additional grant. In many ways, this scheme was much better than the right to buy, as tenants living in flats could buy homes with gardens or move closer to family. The obvious benefit of the scheme is that councils retained their housing stock. Another scheme was the discounted sale schemes. Some local authorities had their own versions of discounted sale schemes before the national right to buy policy was introduced. These schemes provided council tenants with the opportunity to buy their homes at a reduced price compared to the market value. There were also shared ownership schemes, which allowed tenants to purchase a percentage of their council-owned property while paying rent on the remaining portion, which were also available in some areas. This arrangement aimed to make home ownership more accessible to those who couldn't afford to buy a property outright. These schemes and initiatives were intended to provide pathways to home ownership for council tenants, and were part of a broader effort to promote individual property ownership and reduce the role of the state in housing provision. Margaret Thatcher's right to buy policy significantly expanded the scope of these initiatives and made it a national policy, offering substantial discounts to council tenants and enabling them to purchase their homes directly from local authorities. The right to buy policy, with its substantial discounts, had a devastating impact on the UK's housing landscape. When the Labour government led by Tony Blair came to power in 1997, they did not abolish the right to buy policy entirely. Instead, they modified the policy, reducing the discounts offered to tenants purchasing their council homes. This decision was influenced by several factors. The right to buy policy had been in place for nearly 2 decades when Labour came to power. It had become popular among a significant portion of the electorate during that time. Abolishing it completely might have been considered politically unpopular and could have cost the Labour Party votes. Labour, like the Conservative Party, believed in promoting home ownership as a means of building individual wealth and social stability. While they were critical of certain aspects of the right to buy policy, they still wanted to support the idea of property ownership for working-class families. Rather than eliminating the policy, Labour chose to modify it to achieve a balance between supporting home ownership and addressing some of the concerns related to the impact of the right to buy on the availability of social housing. Reducing the discounts offered to tenants purchasing their council homes was one such modification aimed at limiting the incentive for tenants to buy their homes at a substantial discount and potentially contribute to the reduction of social housing stock. Labour recognised the importance of preserving social housing for those in need. By reducing the discounts, they aimed to slow down the rate at which council homes were sold to private individuals, thereby preserving some of the social housing stock. In 2008, Prime Minister Gordon Brown introduced a policy allowing local councils to use capital receipts from right-to-buy sales to fund the construction of new homes. This policy aimed to address the ongoing housing shortage and the reduction in council housing stock caused by the right-to-buy policy. It allowed councils to reinvest the revenue generated from selling council homes into building new ones, thereby helping to replace some of the homes that had been sold. However, the construction of new homes using capital receipts from right-to-buy sales was insufficient to fully address the deficit in affordable housing. More than 2 million homes were sold under right-to-buy between 1980 and 1995. Homeless households in England during the 1980s trebled from approximately 55,000 in 1980 to 165,000 in 1990. Labour realised that scrapping the right-to-buy policy would lose votes. Instead, when they came to power in 1997, they reduced the maximum discount from £50,000 to £38,000 in 1999. This helped to slow down the number of properties sold. Labour also reduced the proportion of capital receipts from sales of council housing that local authorities were required to retain, releasing £3 billion. By 2002, many people were warning that the right to buy was making the developing housing crisis worse in many areas. The policy was diminishing affordable housing stock, making it harder for many to get onto the housing ladder. Local authorities are frequently forced to rent their former homes back at market rates to discharge their statutory homelessness duties. In 2000 to 2001, 53,000 homes were sold under right to buy, but only 18,000 new affordable homes were built. David Cameron launched a revamped version of right to buy in 2012, increasing the cap on the maximum discount to £75,000 or £100,000 for London. This meant a quadrupling of the discount in London and a trebling for most parts of Britain. The government pledged that every home sold would be replaced. For the first time, the receipts from additional right-to-buy sales would be used to support the funding of new affordable homes for rent on a one-for-one basis. They claimed this would deliver up to 100,000 new homes and support 200,000 jobs. By 2013, council homes were being built for the first time in 30 years. However, the promise of 100,000 new homes has not been fulfilled, as only one home is being replaced for every 5 sold. Furthermore, the replacements primarily consist of unaffordable, affordable homes, which do not adequately address the loss of social rented housing. This blatant disregard for the public's trust and the failure to provide suitable replacements showcases the flawed implementation of the right-to-buy policy. Recently, there have been proposals to extend the right to buy to housing association properties. This would have severe consequences for both the housing sector and vulnerable tenants. Extending the right to buy to housing associations would virtually dismantle these organizations, leading to the loss of thousands of jobs and the potential collapse of social housing provision. This would be detrimental to the millions of individuals and families who rely on social housing for stable and affordable accommodation. By granting tenants the right to buy their social housing properties, housing associations and local authority housing departments would no longer have a purpose. The expertise and resources they bring to the table would be lost, leaving a significant void in the provision of social housing. The implementation of the right to buy is rooted in ideology rather than reason. Some politicians on the right view social housing as a socialist concept that should be eliminated. However, this perspective needs to recognize the importance of social housing in providing affordable homes and ensuring the well-being of vulnerable individuals and families. The government is neglecting its responsibility to protect and preserve resources for future generations by selling public assets. People under 40 have a right to be angry about the current housing situation. The sale of council homes through right to buy has reduced the availability of social housing for future generations. This, coupled with other factors such as a lack of investment in new social housing, has contributed to a shortage of affordable rental options, and the expansion of home ownership has had an impact on housing affordability for subsequent generations. Rising property prices and a lack of affordable rental options have made it challenging for younger generations to enter the housing market, leading to delayed home ownership and an increase in renting. In response to housing affordability challenges, some individuals and families have had no choice but to live in multi-generational households or share housing with others, including strangers, to make housing more affordable. This trend has become more common in certain areas and among specific age groups. In light of the flaws and consequences associated with the right to buy, it becomes crucial to advocate for the importance of social housing. The case for social housing must be made with greater force and clarity, emphasizing the role it plays in creating inclusive communities, addressing homelessness, and providing stable and affordable housing options for all. Despite its initial popularity, the right to buy policy has proven to be flawed in both economic and social terms. It has led to the privatization of social housing, exorbitant rents, and a failure to replace the homes sold. The proposed extension to housing association properties would only exacerbate these issues and create additional problems for vulnerable tenants. The right to buy scheme continues to shape lives and communities. As we grapple with its impact, it is imperative to keep this conversation going. It is essential to recognize the economic and social fallacies of the right to buy and advocate for the preservation and expansion of social housing to address the housing crisis and promote a more equitable society. We encourage you to share your thoughts on this critical issue. Like and comment below to join the discussion. Together, we can envisage a future where everyone has a place to call home.